Good morning and welcome to the Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting System. And this morning we're going to discuss a particularly influential book that's come out by Canadian author Marci McDonald. And have some discussion about what this book is saying to Canadian culture and also to the religious establishments in Canada. Marci McDonald's book, The Armageddon Factor, The Rise of Christian Nationalism in Canada. Almost serendipitously, Marilyn Robinson's new book, The Absence of Mind, has come out. We're going to primarily discuss Marci McDonald's book, but we'll make reference to Marilyn Robinson's new book as well during the discussion. Ron Dart, a professor at the University of the Fraser Valley, also a noted Anglican scholar, has reviewed Marci McDonald's book, and we're going to interview him today and see what Marci McDonald has to say to us, and also touch a little on Marilyn Robinson's Absence of Mind. One of the big problems in our culture today is the rise of a kind of religious fundamentalism in some quarters, which has brought the American war with science, war against science, into Canada and entered it into politics where we've not experienced this before. Marilyn Robinson is making the point in Absence of Mind that really the rise in militant atheism among such people as Daniel Dennett and Richard Dawkins has really been spawned by the extreme attacks of religious fundamentalists against modern science, which have involved a number of slanders and calling the basic ethics of scientists into question, and scientists have responded with a kind of militant atheism. So extremism seems to have bred extremism, and we'll talk mostly about Marilyn McDonald's The Armageddon Factor. Ron, you've reviewed this book already in writing, and would you give us just a general outline of what The Armageddon Factor is conveying, or seeking to convey?
Well, probably the first thing to note is that Marci McDonald is one of our top Canadian journalists. She was the foreign correspondent in Paris for many years, and then in Washington for many years also. In the 1980s, she did probably one of the preeminent books on Brian Mulroney called Yankee Doodle Dandy, which looked at his connection to the Reagan-Thatcher rise of sort of neo-republicanism. And in The Armageddon Factor, she, because of her experience in Washington, when the Reagan administration came to power, and then people like Jerry Falwell, Moral Majority, Pat Robertson, Ralph Reed, many of these people were a part of the significant turn in American politics that brought Reagan to power, and then Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. to power. Many Canadians said, well, this can never happen in Canada. We are a much more moderate nation. We certainly wouldn't swing to the Republican right in that extreme way. And she said, you know, when I was the Canadian correspondent in Washington, many Americans said the United States will never swing that extreme. And I listened and I watched, and I in fact saw that happening. The Armageddon Factor essentially says, what I heard in Washington and the United States could never happen. I heard many intellectuals, academics, journalists, commentators on culture saying, this could never happen in Canada. And she said, well, I heard that story when I was a correspondent in Washington. It happened. She then further argues that now, the last 20 years in Canada, we have begun to see the swing to the Republican right in Canada in a way that Canada has never experienced it in quite the same way before. Because in Canada, our form of conservatism is what we call high Toryism, or a red Tory tradition, which was much more concerned with the Commonwealth, the strong federal state, higher taxes for the good of one and all. Our recent understanding of conservatism is much more indebted to the Republican tradition of the United States, and certainly in the last 20 years, Canada has come within the gravitational field of that American Republican tradition. It's redefined our very understanding of conservatism in Canada to make it, in many ways, the opposite of what it once was. So the Armageddon Factor not only looks at the political shifts that have occurred in Canada in a way that we are a faint echo of the American experiment, but also looks at, and probably more important, or equally important, is the religious roots of that. Because many of the MPs in Canada, or obviously our Prime Minister Stephen Harper and many of the MPs which work with him, have been raised or breastfed on a conservative evangelical diet. And out of that, certain ethical positions are taken. You had mentioned, obviously, science. Certain views of Israel are taken. Certain views of traditional family values, gay rights, abortion. There's a whole laundry list of what we call right-wing, hot-button issues in the culture wars. And in each of the chapters of this book, she looks at the major thinkers, think tanks, publications, people that are articulating this right-of-center view.
Yeah, I wonder, though, to how much of this is based in the confusion and fears of greater awareness of the dangers of international relations. Because it seems to me that republicanism, American republicanism or American conservatism, has been rooted in a kind of Calvinist religious point of view since its beginnings. And this, of course, is based in fear. And the fear factor that dominates all of American culture seems to be the main driving force in the United States in our era. And I wonder how much of that has come into Canada, this major fear factor.
Well, there certainly has been a shift in the issue of what you're to be fearful of. And perhaps at two levels of fear drive these two traditions. One is the level of fear on the stage of world politics. You know, in the Cold War, the communists were those we were to be fearful of, certainly since 9/11, but before that, a form of Islam is who we are to be fearful of. So at the larger stage of international politics, we are the righteous nation, we are the New Jerusalem, we are Zion in the flesh, coming out of the origins of the American Republican tradition, which Canada certainly does not have. In sort of our genetic code is not that. There's also the fear of liberalism or secular humanism at the domestic level. So there's two levels of fear. One is the rise of a values tradition in which many on the right will argue this leads to relativism, it leads to the fragmenting of culture, it's anti-religious, and it panders to whatever is trendy ethically. So there's that domestic fear at the level of ethics. And then at the international level, there's the fear of the great global enemy. And it could be, well, it has become, certainly since 9/11, Islam. But with Obama now in power, you get many on the right seeing him as the Antichrist and fearing any form of centrist or soft left of centrist policies in terms of healthcare. So there's fear at two levels, and those can both be broken down at a domestic and foreign policy level.
Yeah, it seems that this religious fear is actually cancelling out much of what Christ taught in the name of Christianity and kind of adopting the extremism of extremist Islam as a response to extremist Islam. We're forming a kind of extremist Christianity, which in its own way is just as dangerous to the overall good of humanity. I wonder if Marci is touching upon that at all.
Well, yeah, she's definitely looking at, like her final chapter, the book is called The Armageddon Factor, the Rise of Christian Nationalism in Canada, because she argues that there is a certain extreme form of interpreting the Bible in the end times. And this apocalyptic, or what we call an eschatological reading of history, is that as the Jews began their return to Israel, it's a sign, and the time is winding in down. God chose the Jews as his chosen people. Therefore, to critique the Jews is to critique God. And so, underlying this whole right-of-center tradition is a much deeper biblical way of interpreting the Bible, which is highly problematic and questionable, but it is rooted in fear. We are coming to the end of history. Be prepared, be afraid, respond. And so it's driven by an underlying way of interpreting the Bible, interpreting history, interpreting where we are at this point in the unfolding of sort of the drama of human existence. But underlying it is fear, because we're coming into a tragic period of history, and some of the signs and indications are, in fact, the Jews returning to Israel, who they're